Now, please.
It's hopeless. We'll never get away now.
We'll think of something.
Outside. Come along. Hurry.
Well, I suppose one way to start talking about Night Train to Munich is to start with the writers of the film, Frank Launder and Sidney Gilliatt, who had very shortly before written the screenplay for The Lady Vanishes and come into great prominence. They had long separate careers in British cinema in the late 1920s through the 30s. They did every kind of writing job imaginable, scripts of their own, scripts with other people, eventually collaborated together on a script in 1936, and then finally, as writers, really made a terrific breakthrough with Alfred Hitchcock, who took up their script, actually written for another director, of The Lady Vanishes.
Have you seen my friend?
No?
My friend, where is she? La Signora Inglese, the English lady, where is she?
There has been no English lady here.
What?
There has been no English lady here.
Launder and Gilliatt always felt that Hitchcock, who I think was not notably generous to his collaborators, had underplayed very much the degree to which they were responsible for the success of the film.
Better take cover. It'll start any minute now.
From 1943 onwards, their careers developed in the direction of writer-directors, and they made many, many famous films. Writer-directors, producers in the end, right through the 40s into the 50s, and even further than that as their careers tailed off.
Night Train to Munich was based on a book written by Gordon Wellesley. It was the starting point for the script that eventually Launder and Gilliatt changed radically. And the film was originally titled Gestapo, but clearly it was felt that because of eventually all the negative publicity coming out of Germany, that the film's title had to change. The first film that Launder worked with Reed on was A Girl Must Live. That was 1939, and he co-scripted that with Austin Melford.
Yes.
And then they made together Night Train to Munich. But that wasn't the end of their collaboration, because as you know, they made Girl in the News, Kips, and The Young Mr. Pitt. And I think they had, didn't they? They had sort of mixed feelings about working with Reed.
Gilliatt felt that Reed had left out the Wellesian social realism which he'd kept within the script of Kips. Later, both Launder and Gilliatt felt that something had gone wrong with the use of their script in Young Mr. Pitt, that the combination of Reed and Robert Donat had somehow turned the script into a hagiography and made it rather slow and ponderous.
Carol Reed was a brilliant craftsman, and this was something recognised by his peers. Both David Lean and Michael Powell are on record as having acknowledged his skill as a craftsman. Powell says that Reed could put a film together like a watchmaker putting a watch together. It's very difficult to really come up with an overall pattern of the sorts of films that Reed was interested in making, because he worked in so many different genres, and he himself used to say that he didn't consider himself as an auteur. He was somebody who, I think, responded to projects and saw it as his duty to do those as well as he possibly could. Reed was also, of course, known as being excellent with actors, he himself having been an actor, a stage actor.
The opening of Night Train to Munich makes it quite clear that war is in the air. It's only later in the film, of course, that war is declared while the characters are in Germany. Whereas in The Lady Vanishes, The Lady Vanishes in 1938. We know it's about Germany, but it's never said, is it? That Bandrika, the place, has got an Italianate language. When all the Bandrikans speak English, they're obviously heavy Germanic accents, aren't they? So we know it's about Germany and the danger of Germany, but it's approached obliquely, whereas it's spelled out at the beginning of Night Train to Munich. There are montages of marching soldiers, occupying soldiers, punctuated by Hitler himself banging his fist down on a map, Austria, Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia. We know from things that are said in the film that characters are aware of the August 1939, the Nazi-Soviet pact, which in a way is liberating the Germans to go into Eastern Europe.
I'm now going to sing the sentimental song hit of the year. They say it's the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, but believe me, it's songs like this that fill it.
It's true. Oh, what it does to me to know it's true. She loves me.
Are you sure it was Gus Bennett they said?
Yes, I'm certain.
Your father's not in the song business?
No,
Oh, it's beyond me. How did you lose him?
he escaped.
The film has, of course, two British players who were at the beginning of their very major careers. Margaret Lockwood, who was fast becoming the most popular female actor in Britain, and Rex Harrison, who was becoming a major figure as well. And the script and the intrinsic personae of the actors, plus Reed's ability to use them, meant a lot to the film. One of the people at Gainsborough, a very influential person, was Edward Black, Ted Black, who was a famous producer, and Margaret Lockwood was one of the stars that he promoted. He said famously about her that she had something with which every girl in the suburbs could identify.
I'm looking for Mr. Gus Bennett. I was told I'd find him here.
Oh, he's along here, all right. You can hear a warbling note like an air raid siren. Well, that's him singing.
Rex Harrison, who of course is the character Dickie Randall, but also plays two other characters. He takes on other personae. So it's a very, very interesting role, isn't it, with three different elements to it. Dickie Randall, the actual character we only see in character for moments in the film. And all in that what was to become the typical Rex Harrison mode, that sort of rather querulous, bad-tempered element, as if sort of always tormented by some private annoyance, his voice cracking constantly, doesn't it, into a higher register. But with all that intelligence and wit going on in the part, it really is a wonderful performance, isn't it?
He retains that aura of the aristocratic man about gentlemen's clubs, soirees, and sophisticated salons. That is something that adds to his detachment and even flippancy in the role of Dickie Randall, whom we don't really, I think, quite believe is going to be the ideal partner for Margaret Lockwood at the end of the film.
Right, well, it is one of those things where convention demands it, doesn't it? The end of the film is really quite abrupt, isn't it? Whereby he descends off the cable car and into her arms, a brief embrace, and then shakes hands with Beaumarchais and goes off.
It's interesting to compare the two, with The Lady Vanishes and Night Train to Munich. There are subtle shifts of emphasis, aren't there? I mean, when you think about The Lady Vanishes, there is more, would you agree? I mean, there's more of a sort of affinity between Margaret Lockwood and Michael Redgrave, largely because of Michael Redgrave's greater ease in the part of the male partner in this relationship. Whereas with Rex Harrison, there's just that element of detachment, of not really being the ideal partner for anyone, not just Margaret Lockwood, but there's something so self-absorbed about him that there's a kind of edginess about the construction of this couple.
Are you just going to sit there and do nothing?
Now, please, don't make a scene.
Don't you realize what this means?
Yes, I do. But he has a gun and I haven't, and he's got a couple of reserves next door. Who'd you take before, Bulldog Drummond?
Oh, can't you be serious even now?
The more superficial image of male heroism that you get in a film like Night Train to Munich. I don't think we would say that Dickie Randall is a fascinatingly dark personality. He has certain even sardonic or even sadistic tendencies, but he's not dark in the sense that the James Mason character in Odd Man Out or the Orson Welles character in The Third Man are dark.
And when you get to the town, ask for a man named Gus Bennett. Have you got the name? Gus Bennett.
Yes, but who do I ask?
Margaret Lockwood is somebody who is above all identified with positive heroic characters, but does occasionally move into slightly darker territory, doesn't she, in The Wicked Lady, and even in Carol Reed's The Stars Look Down. She plays the trollop in that film.
And she didn't like playing those bad girl roles particularly.
In Night Train to Munich, she takes rather a back seat, and it may simply be that with the entry of Britain in the war, a film needs to stress the importance of male heroics.
In both the Hitchcock film and the Reed film, she is sort of kind of the ideal girl, isn't she? But particularly in the Hitchcock, not a passive figure at all.
She has that wonderful moment where she deflates Dickie Randall in the hotel room where they're supposed to have spent the night, or spending the night.
Is anything the matter?
That tune you are whistling, sir, it is an English tune, isn't it?
How do you know?
I heard it on the radio from London last night.
Are you not aware that listening to the foreign broadcast is forbidden, that there is a strict penalty?
I'm sorry, sir.
I will not report you on this occasion, but see that you are more discreet in future. Get out. Very awkward.
Lucky it wasn't Rule Britannia.
Handled it rather neatly, I thought.
You know, if a woman ever loved you like you love yourself, it would be one of the romances of history.
Like The Lady Vanishes, the film also uses the characters Charters and Caldecott, who are obviously a great success from that film. Charters is played by Basil Radford, a much-loved character actor, and Norton Wayne played Caldecott, this pair of upper-middle-class, sporty, middle-aged Englishmen who, of course, as you remember in The Lady Vanishes, their only concern on the trip is, despite all that is going on around them of a sinister nature, is getting back to Manchester for the last day of their test match. That they did become a sort of institution of English film.
What's the matter?
I can't help thinking of your face when he said Major Herzog, Corps of Engineers.
Well, all I can say, Charters, is that when it comes to humour, we live in entirely different worlds.
So these characters, I think, are that kind of institutional character that is at the same time both mocked and loved. They have the deficiencies, but also the admirable characteristics of a certain kind of middle-class Englishness. What is interesting, though, by the way, in this film is that in The Lady Vanishes, they are totally English, totally un-European. They obviously understand nothing and are not at all interested in the culture of the country they're in. But in this film, Charters actually does speak German. He reads Mein Kampf, and even Caldecott might speak French, although he doesn't speak German, because when he can't get a copy of Punch, he's sort of seems to be satisfied with a copy of La Vie Parisienne. And this seems to mark a shift, doesn't it? That in the world of The Lady Vanishes, England is a world to itself and doesn't need to be otherwise. By the time of Night Train to Munich, England is embroiled in Europe fatally and can't avoid being European.
Pushed about from pillar to post by this railway ever since we got on the train.
Yeah, everything we sit on seems to be required.
It's monstrous.
We shall write to the company about this. We're not at war with England yet, you know.
But you are mistaken. France declared war this afternoon, and England declared war this morning. So.
Whoa. Yes. Good heavens.
What's the matter?
My golf clubs.
Where are they?
I lent them to Max in Berlin.
That comedy of understatement is so typical of British humour, isn't it? You find it not only in the cinema, in great writing by such as Launder and Gilliatt, but also in the great novels of Jane Austen, George Eliot, and so forth. There is that strain of English humour, which is litotes, which is understatement.
It's an elusiveness which requires the audience to complete or to complete the statement, doesn't it?
I warn you, Schwab, such treasonable conduct will lead you to a concentration camp.
But, sir, what did I say?
You were distinctly heard to remark, this is a fine country to live in.
Oh, no, sir. There's some mistake. No, what I said was, this is a fine country to live in.
All of that is connected with that endless play with the notion of being a gentleman in the humour of the film. What is a gentleman? More generally speaking, I think the film wants to ask that question, but it has a specific local meaning in terms of the cricketing ambience to which
that's right.
Charters and Caldecott belong, doesn't it?
Yes, that when Caldecott thinks that he recognises Dickie Randall underneath the exterior of Ulrich Herzog, the Nazi that he's impersonating, and a lot of the conversation hinges on the fact that Dickie Randall, who was known to Caldecott at Balliol, played cricket and was a slow leg break bowler, but also played for the gentleman. I mean, this is really a rather complicated point about class meanings, that until well after the half of the last century, English cricketers were divided into amateurs and professionals, and the amateurs were the gentlemen and the professionals were the players, and there was a big game every year. Then there was that debate, isn't there, as to whether somebody who had played for the gentleman could in fact be an international crook.
He says he played for the gentleman, but then Charters has a little pause and says only once, as if to say, well, maybe there is a strain of wickedness about him if he only ever played for the gentleman once. But that whole concept of gentlemanliness, I think, is relevant to wider concerns in the film, isn't it? It's about amateurishness, the British way of not being fanatical about things, of doing things almost because one's prompted to do them. One is involved in the war simply because one has to, but one hasn't been gearing up to it. One hasn't been training for imperial ambition. The country is sort of forced into action, and that's part of the notion of gentlemanliness, isn't it?
One can use that attractive sort of sprezzatura of the amateur who also belongs to the Foreign Office Operatic Society.
Well, they got him out of England. Why shouldn't I get him back?
But that's quite impossible.
Why? I know my way about. I was 3 years in Berlin.
Drinking lager. Vodka now, isn't it? What about the Polish situation? Germany may march at any moment. You know what that means.
I should be back before then. Well, sir?
Well, you know perfectly well I can't give you permission to do it. And the fact that you make the request at all shows you're not yourself. Don't you think so, Gaskin?
Well,
I quite agree with you.
Night Train to Munich is very interesting in all kinds of ways. First of all, as regards its mixture of genre. It's a thriller, it's also a romantic comedy in some ways, isn't it? But it's also interesting as regards its concentration on different levels of British life. I mean, it's mainly about the middle classes and the upper middle classes, but we do get a little vignette, don't we, of the lower classes in that moment where the Skylark brings Margaret Lockwood and Paul von Henried to England. I mean, don't you think that's a rather nice little moment?
And the guy fishing, saying that he's been prevented from getting a Lillian Gish, the Cockney rhyming slang for fish.
Sorry indeed.
All right, granted, me old cock. Have you caught anything?
Few eels.
Oh. Perhaps it ain't fish you've been out to catch. Not like me, fishing to keep away from the old woman.
The British cinema at the beginning of the war is still very, very much a middle-class cinema, isn't it?
On the one hand, it reminds us that Reed is somebody who is interested in other levels of society. So that, for example, one remembers that in The Stars Look Down, that is a film that very centrally looks at working-class life in the northeast of England. But the second thing, maybe, that when all of this activity is going on the battlefields of Europe, the film wants to remind us that normal life carries on, and so fishermen fish and mothers scold their children. It's a picture of England that isn't completely and wholly obsessed fanatically with the kind of political regime that characterizes life in Germany.
Right, and later in the film, Charters, I think it is, says that the Germans are not very good at business as usual. And it's quite interesting, isn't it, that we don't see, I think, a single Englishman in military uniform.
No, the only time that you do is when you have those traitors who come to whisk away the scientist and his daughter.
The naval officer traitors, yes.
Yeah. To go back to your point about business as usual, one thinks of that phrase in that wonderfully comic scene where in the Foreign Office they're discussing various important plans, but one of the mandarins there is reminding one of his colleagues that not to forget to bring the recipe for pickled walnuts for his wife.
Sorry, Fabian. I say, Charles, the wife's just phoned. I understand you're coming over to tea on Sunday.
Yes, I believe.
Well, she wants you to remind Beryl to bring some recipe book, pickling walnuts or something.
Oh, yes, I know.
Oh, hello, Randall. How are you?
Hi. Just discussing the Beaumarsh affair.
There's an interesting comparison to be made, isn't there, between the milieu of the British mandarins in the Foreign Office with their equivalents in Germany. What you get in the British ambience is of a very relaxed atmosphere, don't you, of people kind of lounging around, being rather amateurish in some ways about these grave matters of state. And the pickled walnuts sort of has an earthiness about it, doesn't it? It reminds one, I suppose, of English Women's Institute clubs, of people making jam and doing ordinary, normal things, like the other chap fishing, you know, when in the Skylark scene, and not being distracted by other matters, including the matters of realpolitik and so forth.
Yes, whereas in the German civil servants we seem to have been taken over wholly by the political, and there are moments of resistance.
This is a fine country to live in. This is a bloody awful country to live in.
Usually the humour of the British mandarins is self-generated, whereas the humour of their German equivalents is one where they are the targets of humour.
I suppose one of the interesting things about war films in particular is that under sort of great stress, they have to really project ideas of nationality, don't they? They have to project ideas of what we are fighting for and who we are.
We do not wish to persuade you to become a National Socialist, Herr Bomisch. I have explained that to your daughter, have I not?
And you may work wherever you choose, Father. Isn't that so?
Quite.
After all, we should have our freedom.
I know, my dear, but freedom is strangely interpreted in this country.
I do not agree with you, Herr Bomisch. Freedom in Germany is a great advance on freedom elsewhere. It's properly organized and controlled by the state.
The earlier film, The Lady Vanishes, has been obviously and convincingly read in some terms as a parable of the dangers of appeasement. Well, I think by the time of Night Train to Munich that the period of appeasement is over, and Britain has started to realize that everything is in danger.
You don't choose to stand up when a German officer passes?
See, we're English.
Your passports. Oh, beg your pardon. You're quite right. The English should not stand up. They should go down on their fat bellies and crawl.
Now, look here.
So you are standing up. Very well.
Another thing that's interesting is, of course, the film brings up the subject of concentration camps, because Margaret Lockwood is put in a concentration camp. Later in the film, when she's making one of her jokey, jibing statements to Rex Harrison, she says that his singing of those ridiculous love songs was worse than anything that happened to her in a concentration camp. Well, this would seem in bad taste if it was made in 1943 or 1944, but one must remember that although the concentration camp is presented as brutal, a place where prisoners are beaten and tortured, that this is the extent of the knowledge of what they were. They're not quite what they became.
The film was very well received, both at the box office and critically, both in Britain and in the United States. In the United States, the film was being compared with Foreign Correspondent by Hitchcock. Comparisons were being made between Carol Reed and directors like Preston Sturges. And the New York office of 20th Century Fox, for whom the film was made and by whom it was financed, sent a memo back to London to say that it was considered one of the 10 best films of that year, and that congratulations had to be conveyed to Reed and Black and the other members of the team. It is a film made by one of the major directors in the history of the British cinema.
And it's also an example of the brilliant script writing of Launder and Gilliat. Witty, sometimes erudite, elusive. And in the final analysis, it is a cracking film. It's full of suspense, wit, romance. These are the ingredients of a film that remain of interest and of appeal in modern filmmaking across the world.